And I believe that as a United States Senator, you have to dig your heels in. You have the power of the purse, and that power should be wielded. For example, right now, our southern border is being invaded on a daily basis. It is a violation of the oath of office of our members of Congress as well as our president. And that deliberate invasion can only be stopped with the people that have the backbone to do it. You'll notice that every 6 months they want to raise the debt ceiling in this country. If I were a sitting United States Senator, I would say, I'm not talking to you about money until that border is closed to my satisfaction.
I voted against it for the very reasons I've been attacked by Mr. Cleveland. That is, it put $380 billion of new spending potential, a big hole, a slush fund hole, in the budget to allow the Democrats to spend another $380 billion. Chuck Schumer has been consistent on this, whether it's the PACT Act or other acts that have been pushed through. When he sees one that has Republican support, he adds a boatload of new spending to it and puts Republicans in the position of voting no on things they support or of authorizing hundreds of billions of dollars of new spending. I didn't do it because that's the strategy Chuck Schumer was pushing. And I will say, as far as veterans, in the PACT Act, one of the lead pieces of it was my bill.
I think it's very important that as a senator, as a statesman, we push back at every opportunity and we look at ways to protect our citizens. And then beyond that, I think that we need to look at how does extremism grow in the first place. One of the main ways that extremism grows is because people are very unhappy. Here in Idaho, they've been living under Republican supermajority for over 30 years. Nearly half of them can't afford to make ends meet. They're very unhappy. We need to make investments in our communities and in our state to try to improve those situations and sort of starve out extremism so that they don't have that fertile bed for it to lie in.
Joining me today to discuss those debates are Dr. Stephanie Witt from Boise State University School of Public Service and Bart Davis, former U.S. Attorney for Idaho and former Senate Majority Leader. Dr. Witt, I want to start with you. No secret that Idaho is a deep red state, and this is a pretty safe election for incumbent Senator Crapo. It would be a tough race for a Democrat or a conservative independent. But let's talk about the importance of these challenges, especially when it comes to an incumbent who has consistently held office since the 80s. How do their challenges change the dynamic of the conversations that Senator Crapo might be having on the election trail?
Well, I'd point out first that he's one of the few statewide candidates who've been willing to participate in a debate. And so what the voters get from that is to hear some alternative views on policy issues, to hear some alternative things to talk about that perhaps aren't on the top of Senator Crapo's to-do list. And so it does serve to introduce people to some other ideas. Last time a Democrat won statewide office was 2002. It's very unlikely that anything is going to change in this election. You may see a little higher percentage of Democrat voting in the state. We'll see. That's why we have the election, to see who wins. But I think he's very safe. The familiarity of his name, the powers of incumbency, he's got a really big war chest that he can fund TV ads and so on. So I think he's going to run real strong through the end. He's under it's unlikely that he's going to have a tough race.
But you have a candidate who is a small business owner, an owner of an investment firm in Eagle with Scott Cleveland. And then you have Democrat David Roth, who has extensive experience with housing issues, has worked with low-income Idahoans struggling with food insecurity through his work with the Idaho Falls Food Bank. Those are, both of them bring to the table issues that maybe a lot of politicians didn't necessarily have personal experience with, especially during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And I think we saw that dynamic during the debate that aired on Tuesday.
Yeah, to me, Roth was trying to get those pocketbook issues back on the agenda. Now, in one sense, Senator Crapo is always talking about the pocketbook issues because he often is worried about the budget and adding to the deficit and so on, which is a way of understanding a pocketbook issue. But I think Roth was coming more strongly with, the inflation is hurting people. They need some help. They need a change. Now, if that's going to result in a change in the office holder, I seriously doubt.
You served in the Idaho State Senate for almost 20 years, 19 years, before moving on to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Can you talk about the dynamic when it comes to deciding how you're going to vote on legislation that you have very mixed feelings about? That was a criticism that Senator Crapo received a lot this week, that he voted no on the CHIPS Act, that he voted no on the PACT Act, that he voted no on legislation where he supported the concept but not the spending. How did you make that calculation when you were in the Senate?
Well, in Idaho, we have to, all legislation has to be on a single subject. And so we can't do in Idaho what Senator Crapo described was done to him and others in the U.S. Senate. But it is still true that many times a bill would come up and there was a lot in a bill I liked. I was 60% aye and 40% nay, or just the reverse. Or there were aspects of it that hit the primary policy target, but there was some poison pill language in there that I just felt uncomfortable with. And regardless of who it is in those moments, those are tough decisions. And you sit on the floor sometimes and the first person debates and you know that makes sense and you're going to vote aye. Then the next person debates and you think, on second thought, maybe I'm a nay. And you go back and forth on it. These are hard issues. And sometimes they require hard votes. And there are often times that I would go home at the end of a session and I wasn't sure if I cast the right vote on a few bills. As time went by, I became more confident. But that's, I thought Senator Crapo appropriately described the difficulty of some decisions you have to make.
As Senate Majority Leader, you were pretty good at counting votes ahead of time. Did your calculation ever change if you knew that legislation was going to safely pass regardless of how you voted on it?
No, I don't think the bills that I described, I think regardless of how I voted, probably would have passed. And that's a whole other discussion on when I could allow myself as majority leader to vote against a bill when a committee said it should pass. And so that was another dynamic that I would have to wrestle with, and any member of leadership will have to wrestle with.
Absolutely. Well, this week we also saw a debate between candidates for Attorney General, Republican Raul Labrador and Democrat Tom Arkush. Let's take a look.
When you have a client and initially you give them an opinion, and before you take them into litigation, you sit down and visit with them. I've had 44 years of doing that. I have never had a complaint about a frivolous defense or a frivolous lawsuit. I think a lot of what might be going on is that we never get to the middle. The opinion is written and the state goes straight to litigation.
My record is really clear. I am a strong conservative advocate for the values of Idaho. I am a strong conservative advocate for the people of Idaho, and I will defend them in the courts. I will defend them when I represent them as Attorney General, and that's why I overwhelmingly won in the primary, because the people of Idaho were looking for a new direction in that office. He's going to stand up and tell the legislators that what you're doing is wrong and what you're doing is unconstitutional. My job to work with the legislators is to help them draft it in a way that can be defended in the courts. So you don't have to file frivolous suits. You don't have to file any lawsuits that we're going to lose.
I would like to keep my oath, and the top tier of the oath is the Constitution of the United States. How's that worked out so far? When the legislature decides to pass a blatantly unconstitutional amendment and then spend the Constitutional Defense Fund to defend it, it just costs us money.
Dr. Witt, you mentioned earlier that Idaho is a tough hill to climb for Democrats seeking statewide office. In this race, Tom Arkush has received endorsements from high-profile Republicans, including former Secretary of State Ben Yesursa, former Republican Attorney General and Idaho Supreme Court Chief Justice Jim Jones. How much of that dynamic is going to play into that final vote tally on November 8th?
Well, of course, it's hard to tell in advance if that will sway people who maybe identify as Republicans or are registered Republicans to vote for a Democrat. I don't know. I would expect to see some number of if there are still moderate Republicans, who want to vote for Arcouche as opposed to Labrador. I noticed that Mr. Labrador did a wonderful job of continually reminding people that Mr. Arcouche had his people that were helping him that were once Republican office holders. So I think what we're seeing there is a little evidence of, the Republican majority becoming so large that it's kind of split off into factions. And, Mr. Labrador represents, I think, a further right or maybe a slightly different take on some of those conservative issues than Jim Jones and the people that are standing with Tom Arcouche.
And that split, that divide in the Republican Party is certainly nothing new. We've seen that for many years in Idaho. I wanted to get your take on their interpretations of the Attorney General's job as it relates to the Idaho legislature, because both of them talked about different approaches to defending Idaho's laws and potentially even trying to keep lawmakers out of trouble by working with them to stop them from preventing what they think is unconstitutional legislation. What are your thoughts on their two different takes?
Well, I am an attorney, and I have practiced law a few years shy of Tom, but it's certainly north of 40 years. And the Idaho legislature does not speak with one voice. And frankly, within each party, there are differing points of view. And then the House and the Senate see the world quite a bit different on any given bill. So being able to speak to one or two or a small handful of legislators doesn't necessarily mean you're speaking or working with the entire legislature. But the role of the Attorney General is not to set the public policy of the state of Idaho. That's the legislature's job. The one thing that the Idaho legislature, I think, is missing is a legal guiding hand as they are crafting legislation. When I want to write a bill and I go to our Legislative Services Office, we have some remarkable legal professionals there that help us craft the bills, but they're prohibited from telling you how the courts are going to receive this legislation. They're supposed to wordsmith it, your ideas for you. But having a legal, having an attorney's office in there that can guide prior to asking the Attorney General's office for a legal opinion, I think could be helpful to the state of Idaho. Whether they'll do that or not, I guess only time will tell. But once the legislature is done, then I believe it's the responsibility of the Attorney General's office to find the constitutional seams of the bill and the edges of it. And I frankly, I learned that from this Attorney General. I was not always happy with every opinion we got from the Attorney General's office. But it wasn't his job to tell me what I wanted to hear, which is true for a good lawyer. That lawyer's job is to tell their client what they need to hear. And so, but once we're done, then it's the job of the lawyer to go and fight for the client within the parameters of what they should be doing.
We have about a minute left. When you became a U.S. Attorney for Idaho, you inherited a large legal office with attorneys who had been working there for quite a while. What transition does the new Attorney General, whoever wins in November, what transition do they face when they take office in January?
Well, I've never been the Attorney General of Idaho, and it's a much bigger office and it's much more diverse. But I did have 60 plus people that were hired by U.S. attorneys of different political parties, and it represented a significant portion of the political spectrum. And on day one, I didn't know what I was doing, and I imagine neither of them will either. But they both have the capability of growing into the position. But I learned quickly that for me to be an effective leader, I needed to check my politics at the door. I was hired by the President of the United States and the U.S. Senate to enforce the law as it was written. And that's what the people who were there when I arrived had been doing, some for decades before, and I have confidence that they'll continue to do afterwards. Now, I know many of the deputy attorney generals over there right now in the state of Idaho. They're remarkable. They are remarkable. And I know that their politics was different than mine. But they did not bring their politics to the legal advice that they provided. And I was grateful for that. Frustrated, but I was grateful.
Well, we will keep an eye on that transition no matter who wins. Former U.S. Attorney for Idaho, Bart Davis, Dr. Stephanie Witt, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you.